Hello, my name is Andy Pavord, and I want to talk to you about the federal budget. We hear about the federal budget all the time in the news. We hear about things like, the budget deficit, continuing resolutions, government shutdowns. It's all in the newspapers and the media all the time. Today, I want to talk to you about a very basic question. What is the federal budget? Now, I have a background in the federal budget. I worked in the federal government as the budget director for the U.S. Small Business Administration, the deputy budget director for the Department of Treasury, and the CFO, the chief of staff to the CFO of the Department of Veterans Affairs. My company, this Federal Consulting Alliance, does budget systems implementations, and we do a lot of training. I also teach a national budgeting course at George Mason University as an adjunct professor of political science. So I hope in the coming weeks to offer some videos that explain the federal budget process, to talk about the size and scope of the federal budget. It's 25% of our gross national product, and how that huge spending impacts our daily lives and maybe the lives of our children. So today I want to begin with a very basic question. What is the federal budget? Now, when we think about the federal budget, we got to begin with the concept of appropriations, because in the beginning there were only appropriations. The Constitution establishes the requirement for appropriations, but it does not establish a budget process. This big, complicated budget process that we hear about in the news is purely the creation of Congress and the president. It is not mandated by the Constitution. So let's look to the wording of the Constitution. Section 8 grants the power to spend. Now, it's important to remember that in the Constitution of the United States, under our theory of government, the people are sovereign. The people are the ultimate source of power. And through the Constitution, they delegate powers to the federal government. And only powers delegated may be exercised. So Section 8 grants the power to spend. Now, let's just read this. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Well, that seems like a very broad scope of power. You can raise money to pay debts, so the power to borrow is stated clearly in the Constitution, but also to provide for the common defense and the general welfare. Well, those are broad terms, and there's been great debates going back to Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson about the exact contours of what that power is. But it is an enumerated power. But it has limitations. Section 9, the next section of Article 1, is a limitation on federal spending power. It states no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So if the federal government is to spend money, there must be a law. It must be pass the House, it must pass the Senate, it must be signed by the president. This provision of the Constitution is what makes accounting in the federal government much more complicated than accounting in the private sector, because accounting in the federal government is designed to make sure and show that every penny spent by the federal government is authorized or appropriated by a specific law. Then Section 9 moves on to require transparency. It says a regular statement of account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So the framers of our Constitution, looking back to the English precedent, understood that an appropriation power without transparency, without public statements, means nothing. So the requirement to make budget decisions, appropriations decisions public is written into our Constitution. Now you can see there are limitations to the appropriations power. The president may only spend funds appropriated by Congress. There's no such thing in American law as executive appropriations. Now, there is originally an English law because the king had the prerogative to spend money on certain things even without parliamentary approval. But there is no such power in American law. But there is also the sense that appropriations may not be used to violate constitutional rights. You cannot spend money. The president cannot sign a law passed by Congress that says we're going to establish a church. We can't fund a national church. We cannot fund efforts to get rid of the freedom of press. Now, of course, there's constitutional law and what exactly that means, Supreme Court rulings and things like that, but it is a limitation. There's also the idea that Congress may attach requirements to appropriations. Congress, through the appropriations process, gets to specify not just how much money is spent, but the exact conditions under which it must be spent. And part of that is the dual limitation in any appropriation law of the amount of money that is appropriated and the object or purpose for which the appropriation is to be applied. Now, let's just take a minute and look at the first appropriation law in 1789. It said that basically there was appropriated for the present year. Notice they put, following the English precedent, a time limit on the appropriations of 1 year, and they specify that it's $216,000 for defraying the expenses of the civil list. And that's just a list of people who the Congress, for various reasons, usually some sort of public service, decided are deserving of annual payments. Then there's a sum for the War Department of War, $137,000, $190,000 for discharging the warrants issued by essentially the Board of Treasury under the Articles of Confederation, and then $96,000 for pensions. That's it. One paragraph, 4 numbers. That was the original appropriation law. Now think how far we've gone, where we have these omnibus appropriations with 1,854 pages and things like that. Very complicated. Over the time, the appropriation process is expanded. Now, in appropriations in the 19th century, they were driven by the desire of Congress to control the executive. So the Americans in the early 19th century were very skeptical of executive party power. Remember, they had just revolted against the king in England. So to control the executive, the Congress passed very detailed line item appropriations that specified exactly what the Congress and what the president could spend money on. And that led to a sort of appropriations process. So what happened is the agency heads, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Navy, the Secretary of State, and other department heads would prepare estimates of how much funding would be required for the next coming year. And they sent these estimates to the Secretary of Treasury. And the Secretary of Treasury would compile them, generally without revision, and transmit them to Congress. And the practice emerged that they would send it to Congress in December. Note that the presidents were totally uninvolved in the appropriation process. They did not review the appropriations, they did not revise them, and they did not approve the estimates. The estimates went to Congress without the approval of the president. So it was a very different process than what we have now, and it was not a budget process. And this led to chaos. As the country grew and spending became bigger, appropriations were the system of detailed appropriation law placed real power over agencies in Congress rather than agency heads. So the members of the Appropriations Committee in Congress had all the power to control the departments in very detailed ways. So this led to games being played, appropriations games, where agency estimates were inflated because they thought that Congress would show its power by cutting their estimates. So there was inflation. There was a lack of accurate appropriations request. And there was no real transparency, even though the requirement on the Constitution to provide a statement of accounts, it was not a comprehensive statement. It was confusing. There was no clarity in what was going on. And this led to the idea that there was no effective management of the federal government and its finances. Now, as the century ran on and we get into the late 19th century, we have the era of the rise of the great corporations, the big, now we call them robber barons, and the trusts. And we now look back on them and say, they were causing all kinds of problems. But back then they were the heroes because they were doing amazing things. Rockefeller was putting oil in every family's homes through Standard Oil, and that gave the gift of light. The great train companies were able to crisscross, improve travel. They were enormously complicated. They were able to manage a complex system. Carnegie Steel Corporation was building massive amounts of steel. So these great corporations were very well thought of. They were viewed as the future of American, the way to do things correctly. And so it was only natural that when people looked at the chaos in the government, and they started looking at city governments first, right? Because in the 19th century, with the massive immigration, there was the growth of the great cities. And this required huge city governments that had never happened before, mainly to educate children's. Public school system created a bureaucracy that our country had never seen before. And then street lighting and plumbing and sewer systems, all that created new government functions that were complex and they were expensive. And they didn't have a good way to manage the city money. And that led to major corruption scandals in New York City and other major cities. So big business got together and decided that the chaos in municipal government wasn't good for business. And they hired essentially a team of experts. William Allen, a University of Chicago economist, PhD, Henry Brewer, an economist and social worker, and Frederick Cleveland, a Wharton PhD finance professor. The big businesses hired these people to bring the idea of a budget to government. So the idea of a budget came from the private sector. It came from the great corporations. And in the great corporations, there was a leader, a CEO, who was required to develop a budget. And the budget was a means of showing that the company was finances, showing to investors that the company's finances were in line and were above board. And then investors could safely put their money into these corporations. And so this idea of a budget gets brought to the New York City. And the idea here is that there should be transparency, which in New York City started with the idea of let's create organization charts, because before the New York Bureau of Municipal Research, no one really knew how many people were working in New York City government. And they brought the idea of accounting, the idea that you should keep track of your money in a way that you can publicly report. And so they had this idea that the accountable executive will develop a budget for the city. The mayor will develop a budget for the city. But to preserve democracy, it was the representative legislature, the city council in the case of New York City, would approve a budget. And this plays a critical role of expertise, because now budgeting is not something that the everyday person can do. Now, remember, in American government, through the 19th century, the Jacksonian idea of government bureaucracy is something simple, that everybody can understand it, anybody can do it, and therefore it should be subject to the spoils of political parties. So the party hacks can get in there and do the job as good as anyone, so why not give the job to party people as a reward for political effort? In the 19th century, that idea is going away. We're having the idea of a civil service of competent executives. And the New York Bureau of Municipal Research says budgeting needs to be like that. Budget is a part of scientific management. It uses statistics to improve efficiency. So now the idea is public management is a highly technical field that requires experts, and budget is part of that. So now with the idea of the New York Bureau of Municipal Research, It's the idea that the budget is the key tool for restoring democracy by building the connection between people and their leaders. The leader presents a budget to the elected representatives in the legislature. And that becomes the idea of the budget. And it takes hold in local governments and state governments across the country. They look to New York, and New York does it first, but people look to New York as a model. And this idea spreads on state and local government across the country. But then the idea of what is a budget is established. And there is a movement to create this idea and bring it to the federal government. So people like Frederick Cleveland write a book called The Evolution of the Budget Idea in the United States. And this is in 1915. So we're getting ready for World War I and a massive expansion of government spending. But Cleveland comes up with a definition of a budget. A budget is used to mean a plan for financing an enterprise or government during a definite period, which is prepared and submitted by a responsible executive to a representative body whose approval and authorization are necessary before the plan may be executed. So this idea of a budget, this is what we mean today about what is a budget. And it comes embodied in American law through the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. So this act, passed during the Harding administration, mandates that only the president can submit a budget request to for the executive branch. It says the president must submit a budget, but it has to go, all the agencies now have to go through the president. So no longer can the Secretary of War send a budget request directly to Congress. It turns the president into a CEO who is responsible for developing a plan for the entire government. And that's the birth of a budget in law. It also created a Bureau of Budget, because if you're going to ask the president to do this task of formulating a budget, he needs a staff of experts, impartial, non-political, impersonal experts. And now eventually this Bureau of the Budget becomes OMB, the Office of Management Budget, which still today serves as a staff to the president. But the Budget Accounting Act of 1921 also created GAO, which is a legislative branch agency, which sets up the accounting processes for the federal government to make sure that they're transparent. Because remember, way back, power over appropriations does not mean anything if you don't know that the appropriations are being followed. So now it's GAO, which is created to ensure that mission of transparency. So the budget very quickly became very important in our federal government. And in 1927, Willoughby, who was a famous political scientist, published a book called The National Budget System. So already we have a system. And he says here, the specific problems of public administration, none exceeds in importance the establishment of an orderly and efficient system for the handling of financial affairs of government. And that's the budget. There is now, he says, substantial agreement that this task of determining, making provision for, meeting the financial needs of a government cannot be properly performed unless you use a budget. So in like 6 years, the budget has been recognized widely as the key part of government. And then he describes what it is as a document which brings together and balances against each other statements regarding the condition of the Treasury, which means how much money the government has, revenues and expenditures in the past, an estimate of revenues and expenditures for the future. And so Willoughby and others, put the budget at the center of our political process, because in government, if you can't spend money, you really can't do anything. So now let's answer the question that we began. What is the budget? It's a proposal submitted to Congress by the President of the United States. And now, according to law, it should be done in February of each year. But of course, during transition years, that's pushed back because you put a president is inaugurated in January 20th. He can't produce a budget in a couple of weeks. But normal years, it's supposed to be done in February. It's produced in 3 volumes under the authority of the President of the United States by the office of his staff, the Office of Management and Budget. Now, we're going to go into in other videos the details of what's in the president's budget, but that is what it is. It is the volume, a document produced by OMB under the authority of the president, submitted to Congress, where Congress will create the appropriation laws in conformity to the budget. So I just want to end with a quick commercial to join the American Association for Budget and Program Analysis. This is a nonprofit organization. It's all volunteer. Go to this website and please join. It's only $45 a year, and you get to participate in seminars and webinars and help promote the mission of educating people about the budget. So that's all I have to say in this video. Look, I hope you join me. I hope you found this useful and will join us in future videos.